Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less academic and a lot more herbal. A trip through the foggy, fragrant world of medieval intoxication. Yes, they did it. But trust me, things got weird and sometimes surprisingly creative. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as a grim, mud-covered parade of monks, plagues and potatoes. But under all that wool and despair, there were people. Regular, flawed, experimental people, who occasionally looked at a strange root and thought, well, let's see what happens if I drink this with hot wine. And to be fair, who could blame them? There was no electricity, no coffee, no antidepressants, and the local entertainment was either watching a knight try to read or wondering how long your neighbour could keep dancing before collapsing from ergot poisoning. So if someone told you there was a mushroom that made you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably chew it too. Contrary to modern assumptions, the concept of using substances to expand the mind, escape pain, or simply make one's day slightly less horrible wasn't rare. It was baked right into the culture. But it wasn't called getting high. There were no medieval stoner duos giggling behind the haystacks. It was wrapped in terms like visionary states, divine inspiration, pain relief, or in extreme cases, uh-oh. Doctors used herbs, monks grew them, witches, depending on who you asked, applied them, and almost everyone encountered these substances in some form, through medicine, ritual, or accidental consumption of mouldy bread. Again, the range of medieval intoxicants wasn't limited to a tankard of warm ale, though that helped. They had roots that screamed, flowers that blurred vision, seeds that induced prophetic dreams, and ointments that made people believe they were flying naked through the sky with Satan's catering team. Getting high wasn't necessarily recreational. It was medicinal, spiritual, or sometimes just very poor judgment on an empty stomach. And depending on your social rank, it might have been delivered by a barber, a nun, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf, who learned it from a very wise squirrel. Chapter 1. Nature's Pharmacy. The plants that made medieval people see God or demons. In the medieval world, you didn't need a shady back alley or a velvet-roped club to get your hands on mind-altering substances. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a vague disregard for dosage. Because in those days, nature was the dealer, and she wasn't always gentle. Medieval Europe was overflowing with plants, roots, fungi and resins that could either cure your headache or make you believe you'd married a tree. The line between medicine and mystical trip was, let's say, artistically interpreted. Physicians, monks, midwives, and wandering herbalists all dabbled in botany with varying levels of training and enthusiasm. If you wanted something to knock you out, calm your nerves, or make you see God in your soup, they had options. Take henbane, for example. This plant was like nature's version of Russian roulette. Properly prepared, it eased pain and brought on sleep. Improperly prepared, it introduced you to an entirely new set of problems, like convulsions and a strong desire to remove your own shoes while running through the woods screaming. Medieval physicians mixed henbane into sleeping draughts, pain relievers, and what they called soporific sponges, cloth soaked in herbs and held under a patient's nose before surgery. Imagine waking up from medieval anesthesia not knowing if you'd had your tooth pulled, or if you'd spent the last hour explaining your life story to a talking mushroom. Or mandrake. The root shaped vaguely like a human figure. Legend said it screamed when pulled from the ground, a noise so lethal it could kill a man. That didn't stop people from digging it up anyway, usually by tying it to a dog and standing far away. Ingesting mandrake could induce unconsciousness, visions, and, on a good day, prophetic dreams. On a bad day, well, you wouldn't be needing herbs anymore. The root was used in wine, ground into powder, or carved into amulets. It was believed to cure everything from infertility to demonic possession, though honestly, if your demon was stubborn enough to survive mandrake, you had bigger problems. Then there was belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, which is exactly the kind of name that screams maybe not. It was used to dilate pupils for beauty, hence belladonna, beautiful, lady, but also to treat pain, cause hallucinations, and on occasion, death. Medieval self-care was a bold business. Women would drop belladonna into their eyes to achieve that wide-eyed, otherworldly look that apparently drove men wild. They'd also accidentally poison themselves because beauty is pain, and sometimes that pain is fatal arrhythmia. These herbs were often combined into teas, tinctures, oils, or those famous flying ointments we'll get to soon. And they weren't always consumed voluntarily. Sometimes they were applied during religious ceremonies, medical procedures, or by a well-meaning apothecary who thought, a little extra root can't hurt. But hurt it could. Beyond the infamous three, there were dozens of other botanical bad boys. Datura, also called devil's trumpet, grew wild across Europe and Asia. Eating its seeds or flowers caused delirium, amnesia, and violent hallucinations. People forgot who they were, where they were, and occasionally tried to have conversations with their own hands. It was used medicinally, carefully, but more often it showed up in accusations of witchcraft, because anyone acting that unhinged must clearly be possessed. Poppy was more socially acceptable. Opium extracted from poppy sap was a medieval miracle drug. It relieved pain, stopped coughs, calmed crying babies, and if you had enough, gently escorted you into a dreamless void. Monks grew poppies in monastery gardens. Physicians prescribed poppy wine for everything from toothaches to heartbreak. The downside: addiction, respiratory failure, and the fact that dosing was pure guesswork. Take a spoonful could mean blissful sleep or never waking up. Medieval medicine was a trustful with no one catching you. Ergot, a fungus that infected rye, was the accidental star of the show. When rye was stored improperly, ergot spores grew into dark, toxic growths. Eating contaminated bread led to ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. Symptoms included burning sensations in the limbs, convulsions, gangrene, and, here's the kicker, vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Entire villages tripped together, writhing in the streets, seeing demons, believing they were being consumed by flames. Some historians believe ergot poisoning contributed to events like the Salem witch trials and medieval dancing plagues. Imagine an entire town losing its mind because the baker didn't check the grain. That's medieval life in a nutshell. Cannabis also made appearances, though it was less common in Western Europe than in the Middle East and Asia. Hashish, a concentrated form of cannabis resin, was known to crusaders who encountered it in the Holy Land. They brought back stories, some exaggerated, some true, of assassins who consumed hashish before missions, leading to the term assassin possibly deriving from hashishin. Whether or not that etymology is accurate, cannabis was used medicinally in various forms. It treated pain, induced sleep, and in higher doses caused euphoria and altered perception. Islamic physicians like Avicenna documented its effects, noting both therapeutic benefits and risks of overuse. Mushrooms, particularly Amanita muscaria, the iconic red-capped mushroom with white spots, were used by shamans in northern Europe and Siberia. These weren't your friendly neighbourhood psilocybin mushrooms. Amanita muscaria caused nausea, dizziness, euphoria, and bizarre visions. Users reported feeling like they were flying, shrinking, or growing. Sound familiar? Some scholars believe these experiences influenced folklore, including stories that eventually became Alice in Wonderland. Vikings may have consumed these mushrooms before battle to enter berserker rages, though evidence is debated. What's certain is that people knew these mushrooms did something, and some were brave or desperate enough to find out what. Medieval herbalists documented these plants in texts like the Herbarium and De Materia Medica, though not always accurately. Illustrations were often wildly off, and instructions vague. Boil this root in wine until the moon is full isn't exactly FDA-approved dosage guidance. Still, knowledge was passed down orally, from healer to apprentice, midwife to daughter, monk to monk. These people understood plants in ways we've forgotten. They knew which leaf to chew for a headache, which bark to scrape for fever, and which flower absolutely under no circumstances should be eaten unless you wanted to explain to St. Peter why you thought it was a good idea. Beyond these major players, the medieval botanical arsenal included substances we'd barely recognise today. Wormwood, the plant that would later make absinthe famous, was used in wines and tonics. It had a bitter taste and mild psychoactive properties. Too much caused seizures and neurological damage, but in small amounts, it aided digestion and supposedly expelled intestinal worms. Medieval people drank wormwood wine regularly, not realising they were consuming thujon, a compound that affects GABA receptors in the brain. Mugwort, a common roadside weed, was used in dream pillows and teas. It was believed to induce vivid, prophetic dreams. Modern research suggests it might actually affect sleep architecture and REM cycles. Medieval dreamers stuffed their pillows with dried mugwort, hoping for visions. Sometimes they got them. Sometimes they just got weird dreams about angry geese. It was unpredictable. Nutmeg, that innocent spice in your grandmother's eggnog, was known to medieval traders as a powerful intoxicant. In large doses, several tablespoons of ground nutmeg, it causes hallucinations, nausea, and a hangover that lasts for days. It contains myristicin, a compound that converts to a mild psychedelic in the body. Medieval people who had access to nutmeg knew this. They just didn't advertise it widely, because nutmeg was expensive, and explaining why you needed that much for cooking raised eyebrows. Even everyday garden herbs had hidden properties. Sage, used in cooking and medicine, contains compounds that affect acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter involved in memory and cognition. Medieval herbalists used sage to sharpen the mind and improve memory. They weren't entirely wrong. Parsley in enormous quantities acts as a diuretic and can affect menstruation. Rue was used to regulate menstrual cycles and as an abortifacient. These weren't mystical properties. They were chemistry, understood intuitively through generations of observation. The medieval doctrine of signatures added another layer. This was the belief that God marked plants with visual clues about their uses. A plant with heart-shaped leaves, obviously for heart problems. A plant with red sap, good for blood disorders. This sounds absurd until you realise that sometimes it accidentally worked. Liverwort, which has lobed leaves resembling a liver, contains compounds that actually do support liver function. Was it divine design or coincidental chemistry? Medieval people didn't care. If it worked, they used it. Gathering these plants was an art form. Harvest time mattered. Roots were best dug at certain moon phases. Flowers picked at dawn supposedly had more potency. Seeds collected during specific seasons were stronger. Modern chemistry suggests there's some truth to this. Plants do vary in alkaloid content based on growth stage, time of day, and environmental stress. Medieval herbalists didn't know about alkaloids, but they knew when to harvest for maximum effect. Storage was equally important. Dried herbs lost potency over time. Exposure to light, heat, or moisture could degrade active compounds or cause dangerous molds. A well-stocked herbalist's pantry was carefully organised. Dark jars, cool spaces, labelled bundles hanging from rafters. This wasn't superstition. It was practical chemistry, learned through trial and very memorable errors. Preparation methods varied, wildly. Some plants worked best fresh, others needed drying. Some required alcohol extraction, others worked in water-based teas. Heating could enhance or destroy active compounds. An infusion meant pouring hot water over herbs and letting them steep. A decoction meant boiling them. The difference mattered. Boil mandrake and you might destroy the alkaloids you wanted. Steep henbane seeds too long and you'd create poison instead of painkiller. Medieval people also understood synergy, that combining plants created different effects than using them individually. Wine wasn't just an alcohol delivery system. It was a solvent that extracted different compounds than water. Adding honey changed absorption. Mixing herbs could enhance effects, reduce side effects, or create entirely new experiences. This knowledge was sophisticated, even if the language describing it was not. The garden itself was sacred space for many. Monastery gardens were laid out in specific patterns, healing gardens, had protective herbs at the borders. Each plant had its place, its season, its purpose. To walk through a medieval medicinal garden was to walk through a living pharmacy, a botanical library, a potential death trap, and a connection to the divine all at once. So yes, medieval Europe had a pharmacy. It just happened to be growing in the woods, the monastery garden, and occasionally your nightmares. And the people who knew how to use it, they held power that made authorities deeply nervous. Chapter 2. The healers, herbalists, and definitely not witches. Let's talk about the people who actually knew what to do with all these terrifying plants. The healers, or as the church nervously called them, persons of interest. In medieval society, if you had a toothache, a fever, or a suspicious rash, you didn't call a doctor. Doctors were for rich people who could afford to be bled with leeches in the comfort of their own estates. Regular folks went to the local herbalist, midwife, or cunning woman, someone who knew plants, charms, and how to fix you without bankrupting your family. These healers were often women, though not exclusively. They learned their craft through apprenticeship, family tradition, or sheer necessity. Your grandmother knew how to treat burns with aloe. Her grandmother knew which mushrooms were safe, and her grandmother's grandmother. She knew things the church really wished she didn't. This was knowledge passed down in kitchens, whispered over grinding stones, shared in fields while harvesting. It wasn't written in Latin. It didn't need a university degree. It just worked. Midwives were especially important. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a life or death event, and midwives were the ones who guided women through it. They used herbs to ease pain, speed labour, or stop hemorrhaging. Ergot, despite its dangers, was sometimes given in tiny doses to induce contractions. Mandrake helped with pain. Henbane calmed. Hysteria. Were these safe? By modern standards, absolutely not. But in a world without epidurals or antibiotics, they were the best option available. Midwives also knew how to prepare contraceptives and abortifacients, knowledge that made them both essential and suspect. The church didn't love the idea of women controlling reproduction, but it also couldn't deny that midwives saved lives. Cunning folk were another category. These were the village wise people, men and women who claimed to communicate with spirits, read signs, and heal through a combination of herbs and magic. They'd sell you a potion for love, a charm against evil, or a salve that supposedly made you invisible. Some were frauds, some genuinely believed in their powers, and some, they just knew chemistry well enough to make it look like magic. A powder that sparked when thrown in fire, sulphur, a liquid that changed colour, plant extracts reacting to acid. But to a medieval peasant it was sorcery, and sorcery sold. Monks and monasteries also played a huge role. Monasteries had gardens, libraries, and the luxury of time to experiment. Monks grew medicinal herbs, distilled alcohol, brewed beer, and copied ancient texts on medicine and botany. They weren't opposed to using mind-altering substances. After all, wine was central to the Eucharist, and beer was safer to drink than water. Some monks even documented their experiences with various plants, though they framed it as research or divine inspiration. A monk having visions after ingesting henbane? Clearly God was speaking through the herb. A peasant doing the same. Witchcraft. Double standards were alive and well. Then there were the apothecaries, the medieval version of pharmacists. They sold herbs, minerals, and prepared medicines in towns and cities. Their shops smelled like dried flowers, sulphur, and regret. Apothecaries had some formal training, but they also dealt in whatever sold. Want a love potion? Sure. Need something to curse your neighbour? They'd sell you belladonna and let you figure it out. Their reputation was mixed. Part healer, part con artist, part chemist. But they were accessible, and in a world where illness struck without warning, accessibility mattered more than credentials. Walking into a medieval apothecary shop was an assault on the senses. Bundles of dried herbs hung from ceiling beams, jars, lined shelves filled with powders, roots, and unidentifiable substances. Strange tools, mortars and pestles, scales, distillation equipment, crowded workbenches. The apothecary himself might wear a long robe stained with plant juices and mysterious powders. He'd ask about your symptoms, suggest remedies, and sell you whatever he thought would work, or whatever he could convince you to buy. Quality varied enormously. A skilled apothecary in a major city might have access to imported goods, accurate scales, and knowledge from multiple sources. He'd prepare medications carefully, following recipes from reputable texts. A small-town apothecary might be selling whatever he could forage locally, guessing at dosages and hoping for the best. There was no licensing board, no quality control, no consumer protection. Buyer beware was more than a saying. It was survival strategy. Prices reflected both actual value and perceived demand. Imported opium cost more than local poppy. Exotic spices commanded premium prices. Rare ingredients like unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk or other animal bones, sold for fortunes to gullible nobles. Apothecaries weren't above fraud. Fake saffron, diluted oils, and substituted ingredients were common. Unless you knew your plants, you relied on trust and reputation. The relationship between apothecaries and physicians was complicated. Physicians diagnosed and prescribed. Apothecaries filled prescriptions, in theory. In practice, many people went straight to the apothecary, skipping the expensive physician entirely. Apothecaries learned to diagnose common ailments and suggest treatments. This put them in competition with physicians, who resented the loss of income and authority. Guilds and regulations attempted to maintain boundaries, with limited success. Women worked as apothecaries too, though less commonly, and usually as widows continuing their husband's business. They faced additional scrutiny and skepticism. Of all, woman selling medicines might be praised for her knowledge or condemned as a witch, depending on local attitudes and whether her remedies worked. The double standard was exhausting and dangerous. Travelling healers added another dimension. These were men and women who moved from town to town, village to village, selling remedies and services. Some were legitimate healers with valuable knowledge. Others were charlatans selling coloured water and false hope. Most were somewhere in between, knowledgeable about some things, making it up for others, and always ready to leave town before their failures caught up with them. These itinerant healers brought news, entertainment, and goods from distant places. They told stories, performed minor surgeries, pulled teeth, and sold everything from eyeglasses to aphrodisiacs. Their arrival was an event. People gathered, bought, gossiped, and sometimes got genuinely useful treatment. Other times they got scammed. But in isolated communities with limited access to care, even dubious healers were better than nothing. Of course, there was always the risk of being labelled a witch. The line between healer and heretic was dangerously thin. If your remedies worked too well, you were suspicious. If they didn't work, you were incompetent. If you were a woman, old, poor, or simply too knowledgeable, accusations could fly. The church and secular authorities kept a close eye on anyone dealing in herbs, especially those that caused altered states, a vision induced by prayer, holy, a vision induced by mushrooms, demonic. The difference often came down to who was watching and whether they liked you. The gender dynamics were particularly cruel. Male doctors who failed to save a patient faced professional consequences, loss of reputation, perhaps a lawsuit. Female healers who lost a patient faced accusations of witchcraft. The same knowledge that made them valuable also made them vulnerable. If a woman knew how to prevent pregnancy, induce labour, or cause visions, she possessed forbidden knowledge. That knowledge could save lives, but it could also end hers. Healers understood this precarious position. They were careful about who they helped, what they said, and how they practiced. Many incorporated Christian prayers and symbols into their work, not necessarily because they were devious, but because belief systems overlapped. A charm might invoke both St. Margaret and an old protective rhyme. A potion might be blessed before use. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was survival, and it worked, mostly, until it didn't. Regional variations in healing traditions were significant. Mediterranean healers had access to different plants and Arab medical knowledge. Northern European healers worked with what grew in cold climates and drew on Norse and Celtic traditions. Each region developed its own pharmacopoeia, its own techniques, its own trusted healers. A remedy common in Italy might be unknown in Scotland. This diversity meant that knowledge was simultaneously rich and fragmented. Apprenticeship was the primary method of training. A young person, usually but not always female, would live and work with an established healer for years. They'd learn by doing, gathering plants, preparing remedies, treating patients, cleaning up messes when things went wrong. The education was comprehensive but informal. No exams, no degrees, just practical knowledge tested daily against reality. When the master healer deemed the apprentice ready, they'd set up their own practice, continuing the cycle. Some healers specialised. Bone setters dealt with fractures and dislocations. Tooth pullers extracted rotten teeth, often in marketplace stalls while crowds watched. Eye couchers treated cataracts by pushing the clouded lens aside with a needle. Terrifying, and surprisingly often successful. Herbalists focused on internal medicine. Each specialty required specific knowledge and skill passed down through demonstration and practice. The economics of healing were complicated. Wealthy clients paid well, sometimes in cash, sometimes in goods or favours. Poor clients paid what they could: a chicken, a basket of grain, help with harvest. Some healers charged nothing, sustained by charity or other work. Others demanded payment up front, knowing they might never see the patient again. Economic survival often competed with ethical obligation, and healers made difficult choices daily. Witch trials did happen, though not as frequently in the medieval period as in the later Renaissance and early modern era. Still, accusations could destroy lives. Healers were tortured, exiled, or executed based on little more than rumour. The irony? These were often the very people keeping communities alive. Without them, infant mortality would have been even higher, infections deadlier, pain unbearable. But fear, superstition, and political manoeuvring didn't care about irony. Documentation of healers' work was rare. They didn't write treatises or keep detailed records. What we know comes from trial transcripts, scattered mentions in account books, and occasional references in literature. The vast majority of medieval healers lived and died without leaving any written trace. Their knowledge survived only through their apprentices, and when that chain broke, the knowledge vanished. Yet their impact was immense. Every baby delivered, every fever reduced, every wound treated, every pain eased. These were the real achievements. No monuments, no fame, just countless individual acts of care in a world that desperately needed them. Medieval healers worked on the front lines of human suffering with inadequate tools, dangerous substances, and no safety net. They saved lives, eased deaths, and occasionally made things worse. But they tried. In a brutal world, that mattered. So when you needed medicine in medieval Europe, you turned to people who existed in society's margins, respected, feared, essential, and endangered all at once. They weren't doctors. They weren't priests. They were the original underground wellness influencers, operating in a world where helping someone could get you thanked or burned, often depending on the weather, and they did it anyway because someone had to. Chapter 3. Flying Ointments and Witches' Brews. Fact, Fiction, and Really Bad Recipes. Let's address the elephant in the cauldron. Flying ointments. You've heard the stories. Witches rubbing strange salves on their bodies, mounting broomsticks, and soaring off into the night to attend Sabbaths with the devil. Wild, right? Here's the thing. It's not entirely fiction, but it's also not quite what you think. Flying ointments were real. We have recipes, lots of them, documented in trial records, grimoires, and medical texts. These ointments typically contained a mix of fat, often lard or rendered animal fat, combined with powerful psychoactive plants, henbane, belladonna, mandrake, hemlock, and sometimes opium or aconite. The fat acted as a carrier, allowing the active compounds to be absorbed through the skin. And here's where it gets interesting. These compounds are absorbed much more effectively through mucous membranes. So where do you think people applied these ointments? If you guessed on a broomstick, which was then placed between the legs, congratulations. You've discovered why broomsticks became associated with witches. This wasn't about sweeping. This was about the most efficient delivery system for transdermal alkaloid absorption. Medieval people didn't phrase it that way, obviously, but they understood that applying the ointment to sensitive areas worked faster and stronger. What happened when someone used these ointments? They didn't actually fly. Shocker, I know. But they absolutely believed they did. The combination of tropane alkaloids from belladonna and henbane, plus other compounds, caused powerful hallucinations. Users reported sensations of floating, weightlessness, rushing through the air, transforming into animals, and attending gatherings in distant places. Their bodies stayed put, but their minds went on wild journeys. These experiences felt real. Terrifyingly, vividly real. People would wake up convinced they'd flown to a mountaintop, danced with demons, kissed the devil's backside, and returned before dawn. They could describe these events in detail. The other attendees, the feasts, the rituals. This wasn't lying. This was what we'd now call a shared cultural hallucination, shaped by existing beliefs about witchcraft and the supernatural. The church took these confessions very seriously. If someone said they flew to a Sabbath, tortured them until they named accomplices, and you had yourself a witch hunt. The fact that it was chemically induced hallucination didn't matter. The confession was enough. And because the ointments actually worked, in the sense that they produced the described experiences, people genuinely believed in their efficacy. But who was actually making and using these ointments? Probably not the stereotypical crone in the forest. More likely, it was people experimenting with folk medicine and psychoactive substances, either for healing, spiritual purposes, or simple curiosity. Some may have been genuine practitioners of pre-Christian traditions. Others were just medieval folks trying to escape reality for a few hours. Can you blame them? Life was short, brutal, and dominated by forces beyond individual control. A little herbal escapism might have been the only vacation available. There were also rituals and ceremonies that incorporated intoxicants. Some scholars believe remnants of pagan traditions survived in rural areas, hidden under a veneer of Christianity. Seasonal festivals, harvest celebrations, and solstice gatherings might have included communal drinking of herbal brews or inhalation of smoke from burning plants. These weren't necessarily about worshipping devils. They were about community, tradition, and connection to the agricultural cycle. But if the local priest caught wind of it, suddenly it was a Sabbath, and everyone involved was in deep trouble. Recipes for these ointments and potions varied wildly. Some were relatively mild, a bit of poppy in wine, some calming herbs in oil. Others were absolutely unhinged. One recorded recipe included baby fat. Yes, you read that right. Accounts from witch trials describe ointments made from the rendered fat of unbaptized infants. Did this actually happen? Almost certainly not. These confessions were extracted under torture and included whatever the interrogators wanted to hear. Accusations of infanticide and cannibalism served to dehumanize the accused and justify their execution. But the fact that such recipes were recorded shows how deep the fear and paranoia ran. More plausible recipes focused on available plants. Mix henbane seeds with lard. Add belladonna leaves. Grind in some hemlock root. Heat gently and strain. Apply liberally to pulse points. Or, elsewhere. Wait for the hallucinations. One Italian Renaissance account describes women rubbing themselves with such ointments and then falling into deep sleeps during which they dreamed of flying and feasting. When awakened, they insisted the experiences were real and became angry when told otherwise. The line between dream and reality blurred completely. Modern attempts to recreate these ointments have been conducted by researchers, carefully, legally, and with proper precautions. Results confirm that the alkaloids in these plants do absorb through skin and cause hallucinations, disorientation, and sensations of flight. They also cause nausea, rapid heartbeat, and sometimes dangerous physiological responses. Medieval people didn't have poison control centres. If the dose was wrong, you just died. And plenty did. The cultural impact of flying ointments can't be overstated. They fed into the entire mythos of witchcraft that dominated European thought for centuries. The image of the witch on a broomstick flying through the night became iconic. It appeared in art, literature, folklore, and eventually children's stories. What started as a method of drug delivery became a symbol of female power, danger, and otherness. The witch became the ultimate outsider, someone who rejected societal norms, possessed forbidden knowledge, and consorted with forces beyond human control. Of course, not everyone who used psychoactive herbs was accused of witchcraft. Physicians used the same plants, monks grew them, apothecaries sold them. The difference was context, authority, and gender. A male doctor administering henbane was practicing medicine. A female healer doing the same was practicing witchcraft. The substance didn't change. The perception did. So yes, flying. Ointments were real. Witches flying through the sky were not. But the experience of flight, the genuine belief in those journeys, and the cultural panic they inspired, all very real, and they all started with some very questionable plants and a complete disregard for proper dosage. Chapter 4. Alcohol, medieval Europe's most popular drug, and it wasn't even close. Let's talk about the substance that medieval people consumed more than water, trusted more than doctors, and considered essential to daily survival: alcohol. In the Middle Ages, everyone drank, and I mean everyone. Men, women, children, monks, nuns, kings, peasants. All of them drank beer, wine, mead, or cider nearly every day. Not because they were all raging alcoholics, though some definitely were. They drank because water was often unsafe. Rivers were contaminated with waste, wells could be tainted, and without modern sanitation, drinking plain water was genuinely risky. Alcohol, however, required fermentation, and fermentation killed pathogens. A weak beer or diluted wine was safer than the cleanest-looking stream. Beer was the drink of the common people. It was brewed at home, in monasteries, and in taverns. Medieval beer wasn't like modern beer. It was thicker, cloudier, less carbonated, and often flavoured with herbs instead of hops. Groot, a mix of bog myrtle, yarrow, and wild rosemary, was the common additive before hops became standard. Groot ale had a slightly bitter, earthy taste and, depending on the herbs used, mild psychoactive effects. Yarrow, for instance, can be mildly narcotic. Bog myrtle has sedative properties. So your daily bread and beer breakfast? It might have had a bit more buzz than you'd expect. Alcohol content varied, but daily beer was usually weak, around 1 to 3% alcohol by volume. Enough to be safe, not enough to get you stumbling drunk. Unless, of course, you drank several litres, which people absolutely did. A typical labourer might consume 2 to 3 litres of beer a day. For children, beer was diluted even further, creating what was called small beer. Giving toddlers beer sounds insane now, but in context, it was practical hydration. Wine was the drink of the wealthy and the church. Grapes didn't grow everywhere, so wine had to be imported in many regions, making it expensive. The quality ranged from sublime to barely drinkable. Rich nobles had access to fine wines from France, Italy and Spain. Peasants, if they drank wine at all, got the sour, vinegary stuff that had turned during transport. Wine was also essential for the Eucharist, which meant the church controlled vast vineyards and wine production. Monks didn't just pray, they also made some of the best wine in Europe. Then there was mead, the drink of warriors, poets, and anyone nostalgic for pre-Christian times. Mead, made from fermented honey, was ancient. It predated beer and wine in many cultures. In medieval Europe it remained popular, especially in northern regions where grapes didn't grow and barley was scarce. Mead could be sweet or dry, strong or weak, plain or spiced with herbs and fruits. It was associated with feasting, celebration, and epic sagas. Vikings drank it. Anglo-Saxons filled mead halls with it. It was the drink of heroes, or at least the drink people drank while pretending to be heroes. Cider, made from fermented apples, was common in regions with orchards. Like beer, it was a daily beverage, safe and abundant. Perry, made from pears, also existed, but was less widespread. Both could be quite strong, and both were consumed year-round. Harvest festivals often featured fresh cider alongside older, stronger brews. Getting drunk during harvest was practically tradition. But medieval people didn't just drink for hydration. They drank socially, ritually, and medicinally. Taverns were social hubs where news was shared, deals were made, and fights inevitably broke out. Drinking was communal. You didn't sip alone in silence. You drank with friends, strangers, and that guy who definitely owed you money. Toasts were given, songs were sung, and if you were lucky you left with your teeth intact. Alcohol was also medicine. Feeling sick? Drink hot wine with herbs. Injured? Wine to clean the wound, beer to dull the pain, can't sleep, mead with poppy. Childbirth? Wine, and lots of it. Medieval physicians prescribed alcohol for nearly everything, and honestly, given the lack of alternatives, it wasn't the worst idea. Alcohol is an antiseptic, a painkiller, and a decent distraction from the fact that your leg might need amputation. Religious life and alcohol were deeply intertwined. Monasteries brewed beer and made wine both for their own consumption and for sale. Monks were allowed a daily ration of beer or wine, usually about a litre. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing skills. Trappist monks, for example, produced beers that are still renowned today. The idea that monks were sombre, abstinent figures is only half true. They prayed hard and drank regularly. Feast days and holidays involved serious drinking. Christmas, Easter, saints' days, harvest festivals, all excuses to drink more and stronger alcohol. Were sailing, a tradition of toasting and drinking spiced cider, was common in England. The drink itself, wassail, was a hot mulled cider or ale mixed with spices, honey, and sometimes eggs. It was passed around in a communal bowl, and everyone drank from it. Hygiene, not a priority. Good times, apparently. Drunkenness was common and to an extent tolerated. Public intoxication wasn't necessarily scandalous unless it led to violence or blasphemy. People stumbled home from taverns, passed out in streets, and woke up in strange places. The church officially frowned on excessive drinking, but enforcement was inconsistent. A drunk peasant was a minor nuisance. A drunk priest was a scandal, though it still happened. Alcoholism, though not, understood in modern medical terms, was recognised. Chronic heavy drinkers suffered from what was called the falling sickness, or other ailments we'd now attribute to liver damage and neurological issues. Some people drank themselves to death. Others drank just enough to make life bearable. The line was personal and often crossed. There were also stronger spirits, though they arrived later in the medieval period. Distillation techniques, imported from the Islamic world, allowed for the creation of aqua vitae, water of life, an early form of distilled alcohol. This was much stronger than beer or wine, and it was initially used medicinally. Alchemists and physicians experimented with it, believing it had near magical properties. Over time, it became recreational. By the late Middle Ages, distilled spirits were spreading, setting the stage for the liquor culture of later centuries. The process of distillation itself seemed almost magical to medieval observers. Heat wine or fermented grain mash, collect the vapour, condense it, and you had liquid that was stronger, burned if ignited, and hit much faster than beer. Early aqua vitae was harsh, impure, and sometimes dangerous. But it was also fascinating. Alchemists believed distillation purified substances, revealing their true essence. If you could distill wine into something stronger, why not distill other substances? Gold, perhaps? The philosopher's stone? The ambitions were grand, even if the results were usually just very strong alcohol and disappointed investors. Medicinal uses of distilled spirits multiplied. Mixed with herbs, it became a tincture, a concentrated medicine that could be stored long-term and dosed precisely. Mixed with honey and spices, it became a cordial, supposedly good for the heart. Mixed with nothing, it was still medicine, at least officially. Physicians prescribed aqua vitae for everything from plague prevention to digestive issues. Whether it worked is debatable. Whether patients felt better temporarily? Absolutely. Drinking culture varied by class and location. Noble feasts were legendary for excess. Multi-course meals accompanied by rivers of wine, with toasts, games, and entertainment lasting hours or days. Getting spectacularly drunk was expected, even encouraged. It demonstrated wealth, generosity, and the ability to afford such waste. A stingy host who served weak wine or limited quantities faced social consequences worse than financial ones. Peasant drinking was different. Taverns and alehouses served as community centres. After a day of back-breaking labour, people gathered to drink, socialise, complain about taxes, and temporarily forget their circumstances. The beer was weak, but it was communal. Songs were sung, news shared, disputes settled or started. These weren't quiet establishments. They were loud, crowded, smoky, and occasionally violent. But they were also essential social spaces, especially in winter when outdoor gathering was impossible. Women's relationship with alcohol was complicated. Brewing beer was often women's work. Alewives brewed in their homes and sold to neighbours or from their doorsteps. The iconic image of a witch, pointed hat, broomstick, may have originated from alewives' distinctive markers. The pointed hat helped customers spot them in crowds. The broomstick outside the door signalled fresh beer available. The cat kept mice out of the grain. But when the church began cracking down on independent women in business, these same symbols became sinister. Female drinkers faced harsher judgment than men. A drunk man was amusing or pitiable. A drunk woman was immoral, loose, a scandal. Women who frequented taverns risked their reputations. Those who owned taverns operated in morally ambiguous spaces, providing necessary services while being perpetually suspected of also providing other services. The double standard was suffocating. Drinking games and contests existed. Who could drink the most without passing out? Who could drink fastest? Stupidity knows no historical boundaries. These contests sometimes ended badly. Alcohol poisoning, fights, accidental deaths. But they also bonded groups, established hierarchies, and provided entertainment in a world with limited options. Risky? Absolutely. Popular? Undeniably. Hangovers were universal and universally miserable. Medieval people had their own remedies. Hair of the dog, drinking more alcohol the next morning, was recommended. Certain herbs were supposed to help, soaking bread in wine and eating it. Prayer, obviously. Nothing worked particularly well, but people tried anyway. A medieval hangover involved pounding headache, nausea, dehydration, and still having to work because crops don't care about your poor decisions. Alcohol also played a role in crime and violence. Tavern fights were common. Drunk people made bad decisions, gambling away rent money, insulting the wrong person, starting affairs, committing assault. Court records overflow with cases involving alcohol, yet closing taverns or banning alcohol was rarely attempted. The economic and social costs of prohibition seemed worse than the cost of drinking. Sound familiar? Religious authorities' relationship with alcohol was endlessly hypocritical. Preach against drunkenness on Sunday, drink monastery wine Sunday afternoon, condemn tavern culture while blessing wine production, allow communion wine but condemn excess. The contradictions were obvious to everyone, including the clergy themselves, but alcohol was too embedded in economic, social and religious life to eliminate, so they managed the hypocrisy as best they could and hoped nobody noticed too hard. Seasonal patterns shaped drinking. Harvest time meant celebration and heavy drinking. Winter meant drinking to stay warm, or at least to feel warmer. Spring and summer had their own drinking occasions. Planting festivals, saints' days, weddings, births, any excuse sufficed. Life was hard. If you could find a reason to drink, you took it. Children's exposure to alcohol began early. Small beer for toddlers normalized the taste and idea. By adolescence, young people drank alongside adults. This had consequences. Alcoholism started young for some. Others developed tolerance and habits that lasted lifetimes. The idea that alcohol was inappropriate for children simply didn't exist in the way we understand it now. The economic importance of alcohol cannot be overstated. Brewing and wine production employed thousands. Taxes on alcohol funded governments. Trade in wine and beer connected regions. Monasteries relied on alcohol sales for income. Entire industries supported by humanity's collective desire to be slightly less sober. Remove alcohol from the medieval economy, and the whole structure might have collapsed. Alcohol wasn't just a drug, it was currency, comfort, community, and cure-all. It lubricated social interactions, softened harsh realities, and occasionally caused absolute chaos. Medieval people didn't have coffee to wake them up or aspirin to ease their pain. They had beer, and wine, and mead, and they used them liberally, daily, and with very few apologies. Different alcoholic beverages carried different social meanings. Wine was sophisticated, expensive, and associated with the church and nobility. Beer was common, practical, and democratic. Everyone drank it. Mead was traditional, nostalgic, and increasingly rare as honey became more valuable for other uses. Cider was regional, seasonal, and unpretentious. What you drank said something about who you were, or at least who you wanted to be. The transition from water to alcohol as the primary beverage shaped medieval life in profound ways. It meant constant low-level intoxication for much of the population. It meant productivity probably suffered, at least compared to what it could have been. It meant social bonds formed over shared drinks. It meant health problems from chronic consumption. It meant economic opportunity for producers and sellers. It meant moral anxiety for religious authorities. All of this from the simple fact that water couldn't be trusted and fermentation made it safe. So when we talk about what getting high was like in medieval times, we can't ignore the substance that medieval people were on. Literally, all the time. Alcohol was the baseline. Everything else was just extra, and that baseline meant millions of people going through their daily lives slightly impaired, constantly consuming a drug we now recognize as addictive and harmful, all because the alternative was worse. Medieval life in a nutshell. Chapter 5. Opium and the East. When the Silk Road brought more than silk. While medieval Europe had its own botanical pharmacopoeia, it wasn't isolated. Trade routes, especially the Silk Road, brought goods, ideas and drugs from the East, and one of the most significant imports was opium. Opium, derived from the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, had been used for millennia in the Middle East, Asia and the Mediterranean. Ancient Sumerians called it the joy plant. Egyptians included it in medical texts. Greeks and Romans used it extensively. By the medieval period, opium was well established as a powerful painkiller, sedative, and, in the wrong dose, a deadly poison. In medieval Europe, opium arrived primarily through trade with the Byzantine Empire and Islamic territories. Arab and Persian physicians were far ahead of their European counterparts in medical knowledge, and they documented opium's uses extensively. Figures like Avicenna and Rhazes wrote detailed accounts of opium's effects, proper dosages and dangers. Their texts were eventually translated into Latin and studied in European universities, spreading knowledge of opium's medical applications. Opium was consumed in several forms. The simplest was raw opium, the dried latex harvested from poppy seed pods. This could be eaten directly, though it tasted awful, or dissolved in wine or water. Opium wine, sometimes called laudanum in later periods, was a common preparation. Mix opium with wine, add some spices to mask the bitterness, and you had a potent painkiller and sedative. Medieval physicians used opium to treat pain, insomnia, diarrhea, and coughs. It was incredibly effective. If you'd just had a tooth pulled, broken a bone, or undergone surgery, opium could make the difference between agonizing suffering and manageable discomfort. Of course, it was also addictive, caused constipation, respiratory depression, and could easily kill you if the dose was too high. But compared to screaming through an amputation, those risks seemed acceptable. Opium also had a darker side. It was used in poisonings, both accidental and intentional. A jealous spouse, a power-hungry noble, or a desperate debtor might slip opium into someone's drink. In high doses, it caused unconsciousness, stopped breathing, and resulted in a death that could be mistaken for natural causes. Medieval murder mysteries often featured poison, and opium was a popular choice. The Crusades increased European exposure to opium and other Eastern drugs. Crusaders encountered hashish, opium, and various herbal preparations in the Holy Land. Some brought these substances back to Europe, either for personal use or trade. Stories of the Assassins, a secretive group allegedly using hashish to induce fearlessness and loyalty, fascinated and terrified Europeans. Whether these stories were accurate or exaggerated propaganda, they contributed to a perception of the East as exotic, mysterious, and dangerously intoxicating. Islamic medicine also introduced Europeans to new ways of preparing and administering drugs. Arab physicians pioneered techniques like distillation, sublimation, and extraction. They created tinctures, syrups, and pills, dosage forms that were more precise than the crude plant mixtures Europeans typically used. This knowledge gradually spread into European medical practice, improving the safety and effectiveness of treatments. Opium poppies also grew in Europe, particularly in warmer southern regions like Italy, Spain, and southern France. Monasteries cultivated them in medicinal gardens. Farmers grew them for seeds, which were used in cooking, and for the latex, which could be harvested and sold. Poppy cultivation wasn't controversial. It was agriculture. The fact that the plant produced a powerful narcotic was just a bonus. For the wealthy, opium was a luxury. Imported opium from the East was expensive, and access to it signified status. Rich merchants, nobles, and high-ranking clergy could afford opium preparations for medical or recreational use. For the poor, opium might be available through local healers if poppies grew nearby, but it was far less common than beer or herbal remedies. Recreational use of opium did occur, though it's harder to document than medicinal use. People knew opium caused euphoria and pleasant dreams. Some undoubtedly used it for those effects, not just pain relief. Chronic use led to tolerance and addiction, and while medieval people didn't have the vocabulary of modern addiction medicine, they recognized that some individuals became dependent on opium and suffered when they couldn't obtain it. Trade in opium was legal and unregulated. There were no drug enforcement agencies, no prescription requirements. If you had money and access to a trader or apothecary, you could buy opium. This open market meant that knowledge and use of opium spread relatively freely, limited only by cost and availability. The influence of Eastern medicine extended beyond opium. Medieval Europeans learned about cannabis, frankincense, myrrh, camphor, and other substances from Arab and Persian sources. These imports diversified the European pharmacopoeia and introduced new methods of preparation and use. The exchange wasn't one way. European herbs and techniques also travelled eastward. But the flow of medical knowledge from the Islamic world to Europe was particularly significant during the medieval period. By the end of the Middle Ages, opium was firmly entrenched in European medicine. It would remain so for centuries, eventually becoming one of the most important and controversial drugs in human history. But in the medieval context, it was simply another tool, powerful, dangerous, and indispensable. Chapter 6: Holy Visions and Sacred Smoke. Religion, Mysticism, and Getting High for God. In medieval Europe, the line between spiritual experience and pharmacological effect was practically non-existent. Visions, trances, and mystical states were signs of divine favour. Whether they were induced by prayer, fasting, or accidentally eating the wrong mushroom didn't always matter. What mattered was interpretation. Christian mystics throughout the Middle Ages reported intense visionary experiences. Saints saw angels, spoke with God, witnessed heavenly realms, and received divine revelations. These experiences were taken very seriously. They could elevate a person to sainthood, inspire theological movements, or reform entire monastic orders. But were all of these visions purely spiritual, or did some involve a little herbal assistance? Let's start with monastic life. Monks and nuns lived in controlled, repetitive environments. They fasted frequently, sometimes severely. They prayed for hours, chanted, meditated, and denied themselves sleep and comfort. This kind of extreme asceticism can, by itself, induce altered states of consciousness. Prolonged fasting causes ketosis, which affects brain function. Sleep deprivation leads to hallucinations. Add in the power of suggestion, communal belief, an intense focus on religious imagery, and you have a recipe for visionary experiences without any drugs at all. But monasteries also had gardens, and those gardens grew henbane, mandrake, poppy, and other psychoactive plants. These were used medicinally, but the line between medicine and mysticism was thin. A monk taking poppy wine for pain might also experience vivid dreams or euphoria. A nun using henbane for menstrual cramps might have a vision. If that vision aligned with Christian theology, angels, saints, divine light, it was interpreted as a sign from God. If it didn't, well, that was demonic influence or illness. Incense played a significant role in medieval religious practice. Churches burned frankincense, myrrh, and other resins during Mass and special ceremonies. These substances have psychoactive properties. Frankincense, for example, contains boswellic acids, which have been shown to affect mood and reduce anxiety. Burning large amounts of incense in enclosed spaces, like medieval churches with poor ventilation, could create mildly altered states. The smoke, the chanting, the sensory overload, it all contributed to a transcendent atmosphere. Some mystics went further. They actively sought suffering as a path to God. Self-flagellation, extreme fasting, and physical mortification were practiced by certain religious orders and individuals. These practices caused physical trauma, pain, and stress, which can trigger the release of endorphins, the body's natural opioids. Endorphins create feelings of euphoria and well-being. So in a very real sense, some mystics were getting high on their own suffering, experiencing pain-induced altered states that they interpreted as divine union. There are also accounts of saints and mystics consuming very little food for extended periods, surviving on what they claimed was the Eucharist alone. Some historians suggest these individuals may have been anorexic or suffered from other disorders. Others propose that reduced caloric intake combined with whatever they did consume might have included psychoactive substances. A piece of bread, if made from ergot-infected rye, could cause powerful hallucinations. Wine, especially strong or herbal wine, could enhance altered states. We can't know for certain, but the possibility exists. St. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic, scholar and composer, reported numerous visions throughout her life. She described seeing brilliant lights, divine figures, and complex theological symbolism. Modern medical analysis suggests she may have suffered from migraines with aura, which can cause visual disturbances very similar to what she described. But Hildegard was also a skilled herbalist. She wrote extensively about plants and their uses. Did she experiment on herself? It's possible. Her visions, whether migraine-induced, pharmacologically enhanced, or purely spiritual, were influential and contributed to her eventual canonization. Julian of Norwich, a 14th century anchoress, experienced a series of visions during a severe illness. She described seeing Christ's passion in vivid detail, complete with blood, suffering, and divine revelations. These visions formed the basis of her theological work, which emphasized God's love and mercy. Were her visions fever dreams, enhanced by illness and possibly medication, or divine revelation? For Julian and her contemporaries, the question wouldn't have made sense. Illness and health, body and soul, earth and heaven, these weren't separate realms. They overlapped. Outside of Christianity, remnants of older pagan practices likely persisted, especially in rural areas. Shamanic traditions in pre-Christian Europe used altered states to communicate with spirits, ancestors, and nature deities. These practices involved drumming, chanting, dancing, fasting, and yes, psychoactive plants and fungi. When Christianity spread, these traditions didn't disappear overnight. They went underground, blended with Christian elements, or were reinterpreted through a Christian lens. A pagan priestess became a saint, a spirit journey became a vision of angels, the techniques remained, the language changed. The Church's attitude toward these experiences was complicated. On one hand, visions were proof of God's active presence. Saints had visions. So did prophets. The Bible was full of them. On the other hand, visions could also be tricks of the devil. Demons could disguise themselves as angels. False prophets could lead people astray. So the Church developed criteria for discerning true visions from false ones. Did the vision promote orthodox theology? Did the visionary live a holy life? Did the vision lead to good works? If yes, it was probably divine. If no, it was demonic or delusion. This system worked well enough when dealing with individual mystics. It fell apart when dealing with mass visions. Marian apparitions, sightings of the Virgin Mary, occurred periodically throughout the medieval period. Groups of people claimed to see her, often in fields, forests, or other rural locations. Were these genuine supernatural events, shared hallucinations, ergot poisoning affecting an entire community, fraud, a combination? Without modern analytical tools, it's impossible to say. What we know is that people believed, and that belief shaped actions, pilgrimages, shrines, and devotional practices. Relics and holy sites also played a role. Pilgrims travelled to see relics of saints, bones, clothing, objects. These pilgrimages were physically demanding, involving weeks or months of travel, poor food, and exposure to the elements. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and the anticipation of encountering the sacred could induce altered states. Arriving at a shrine after such a journey, surrounded by incense, chanting, and the collective fervour of other pilgrims, created conditions ripe for visionary experiences. Some pilgrims reported miracles, healings, and divine encounters. Were these purely psychological, pharmacological, spiritual? For the pilgrims, the categories didn't exist separately. It was all real. So yes, medieval people got high for God. Not in the way we'd phrase it now, but through practices and substances that altered consciousness in pursuit of the divine. And whether those altered states came from fasting, suffering, incense, ergot-contaminated bread, or deliberate consumption of psychoactive plants, they were real experiences that shaped individual lives and collective religious culture. The medieval world didn't separate body from spirit, chemistry from theology, plant from prayer. It was all one interconnected mystery, and sometimes that mystery came with hallucinations. Chapter 7. The Dark Side. Poisonings, accidents, and when getting high went horribly wrong. For all the talk of medicine, mysticism, and flying ointments, we need to address the obvious. Medieval drug use was dangerous. Extremely dangerous. There were no quality controls, no standardized doses, no emergency rooms. If you miscalculated, misjudged, or just got unlucky, you could end up dead, maimed, or permanently altered. And that happened. A lot. Start with the most common problem, accidental poisoning. Medieval people didn't have chemical analysis. They identified plants by appearance, smell, and traditional knowledge. But many poisonous plants look similar to edible or medicinal ones. Hemlock, which killed Socrates, resembles parsley and wild carrot. Foxglove looks like comfrey. Aconite, also called wolfsbane or monkshood, is deadly in tiny amounts and was sometimes confused with other roots. Mistakes were made. People died. Even when the correct plant was used, dosage was guesswork. A handful of dried henbane could mean different things depending on whose hand and how dry. Boil until reduced by half wasn't precise. Medieval recipes used vague measurements, and individual plants varied in potency based on growing conditions, harvest time, and preparation. 1 batch of mandrake tea might induce pleasant sleep. The next might stop your heart. It was a lottery. Children were especially vulnerable. Parents and healers gave children herbal remedies without understanding appropriate pediatric dosing. A dose safe for an adult could kill a child. Opium in particular was dangerous. It was sometimes given to infants to stop crying or help them sleep. Too much, and the baby never woke up. Modern forensic analysis of medieval child burials has found evidence consistent with opiate poisoning in some cases. Accidental overdose was likely more common than records suggest, because infant mortality was already so high that one more dead baby might not have seemed unusual. Then there were deliberate poisonings. Murder by poison was a legitimate concern. Nobles, clergy and merchants all feared being poisoned by rivals, enemies, or family members eager for inheritance. Arsenic, mercury, and various plant toxins were used. But psychoactive plants also made good murder weapons. Belladonna, henbane, and aconite could all kill, and in the right dose the symptoms might resemble natural illness. A person poisoned with aconite experienced numbness, paralysis, and heart failure, easily mistaken for a stroke or heart attack. Poisoners had to be careful. Too obvious, and they'd be caught. Too subtle, and the victim might survive. There's a reason medieval nobility employed food tasters, servants whose job was literally to eat the Lord's food first and see if they dropped dead. If the taster survived, the meal was probably safe. If not, well, at least the Lord knew not to eat it. This was not a glamorous job. Suicide by poison also occurred. Medieval Christianity considered suicide a mortal sin, condemning the soul to hell and denying the body Christian burial. Despite this, some people, driven by despair, illness, or unbearable circumstances, chose to end their lives. Poison was one method. Opium, in a large enough dose, could provide a relatively peaceful death. Other poisons were less kind. Hemlock caused paralysis and suffocation. Belladonna caused agony. But for someone determined to escape their life, these were options. Ergot poisoning, or ergotism, deserves special attention. This wasn't about taking drugs recreationally. This was entire communities being poisoned by contaminated food. Ergot grows on rye, a staple grain in medieval Europe. When rye was harvested and stored improperly, ergot fungus spread. The resulting bread, when eaten, caused hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. Outbreaks could affect dozens or hundreds of people at once. Symptoms of ergotism came in two forms. Gangrenous ergotism caused burning sensations in the limbs, blackening and death of tissue, and eventual loss of fingers, toes, or entire limbs. Convulsive ergotism caused muscle spasms, hallucinations, mania, and seizures. Both were agonizing. Both were often fatal, and because medieval people didn't understand germ theory or fungal contamination, they had no idea what was causing it. They called it St. Anthony's fire after the saint invoked for protection and prayed for relief. Some historians believe ergot poisoning contributed to the dancing plagues that occasionally swept through medieval towns. In these events, groups of people danced uncontrollably for days, collapsing from exhaustion, injury, or heart attacks. The 1518 dancing plague in Strasbourg is the most famous example. Hundreds of people danced in the streets for weeks. Some died. Why? Theories include mass psychogenic illness, religious fervour, and yes, ergot poisoning. Ergot can cause both hallucinations and muscle spasms. Combine that with social stress, religious anxiety, and the power of group behaviour, and you get a dancing plague. Chronic use of psychoactive substances also took a toll. Opium addiction was recognised, even if not understood medically. People who used opium regularly developed tolerance, needing more to achieve the same effect. They suffered withdrawal, pain, anxiety, insomnia, when they couldn't get it. Their health deteriorated, some died from overdose, others lived diminished lives, dependent on a substance they couldn't quit. The progression of opium addiction followed predictable patterns. First, genuine medical need, severe injury, chronic pain, terminal illness. Opium provided relief nothing else could, but relief required repetition. Yesterday's dose became inadequate, more was needed. The gap between therapeutic and addictive use disappeared gradually, almost imperceptibly. By the time the user realized dependency had formed, it was too late. Stopping meant suffering worse than the original pain. Physical symptoms of chronic opium use were visible. Pinpoint pupils, even in dim light. Constipation so severe it caused additional medical problems. Respiratory depression leading to chronic fatigue. Malnutrition from suppressed appetite. Users became thin, pale, withdrawn. Their lives narrowed to obtaining and using opium. Work suffered. Relationships fractured. Some families supported their addicted members, others cast them out. There was no treatment, no recovery program, no path back except raw willpower and agonizing withdrawal. Withdrawal itself was torture. Without opium, users experienced bone-deep pain, muscle spasms, vomiting, diarrhea, anxiety, insomnia, and overwhelming compulsion to obtain more. Medieval people had no framework for understanding this as withdrawal syndrome. They saw it as the underlying illness returning, proof that opium was necessary. This misunderstanding perpetuated addiction. Even those who suspected dependency rarely could endure withdrawal long enough to break free. Social consequences varied by class. Wealthy addicts could maintain their habits indefinitely. They had money for pure opium and servants to cover their dysfunction. Poor addicts faced harder choices: sell possessions, borrow money, steal, turn to prostitution, anything to avoid withdrawal's agony. Some succeeded in maintaining functional addiction for years, others spiraled into poverty and death. The substance was the same. Resources determined outcomes. Alcohol abuse was even more common. Chronic heavy drinking caused liver disease, neurological damage, malnutrition, and shortened lifespans. Alcoholics were known in medieval society, and while some pity existed, there was also scorn. Drunkenness was associated with moral weakness, sin, and loss of control. The church preached temperance, even as it brewed beer and made wine. The contradiction was rarely acknowledged. The physical devastation of alcoholism was visible and stigmatized. Bloated bellies from liver failure, trembling hands from nerve damage, red, broken-veined faces, cognitive decline and memory loss, violent mood swings. Alcoholics became unreliable workers, dangerous family members, and social pariahs. Some drank themselves to death slowly over decades. Others went faster, through accidents, fights, or acute alcohol poisoning. Medieval society had no concept of alcoholism as disease. It was moral failure, weakness of character, sin requiring repentance. This framework offered no compassion and no treatment. Alcoholics were told to pray more, show more willpower, and stop sinning. When this didn't work, and it rarely worked, they were abandoned. Families disowned them. Communities ostracized them. Churches denied them sacraments. The message was clear: your suffering is your fault, and you deserve it. There were also mental health consequences. Prolonged use of hallucinogens, especially in unsafe or uncontrolled settings, could trigger lasting psychological issues. Paranoia, anxiety, depression, and what we'd now call PTSD or psychosis were all possible. Medieval people didn't have terms like bad trip or flashback, but they recognized that some individuals never fully recovered from their experiences with certain substances. These people might be cared for by family, confined in monasteries, or left to wander as beggars. The monastery option deserves explanation. Religious. Institutions sometimes took in people whose minds were broken. These weren't mental hospitals in any modern sense. They were places of confinement and prayer. The disturbed person would be given simple work, attended mass, and prayed for. Sometimes this environment helped. The structure, routine, and relative safety allowed some recovery. Other times it was just warehousing the inconvenient until they died. Care quality depended entirely on individual monks' compassion and resources. Wandering as a beggar was the alternative. Medieval Europe had thousands of displaced, damaged people roaming roads and haunting town squares. Some were physically disabled. Others were mentally broken. Many were both. They survived on charity, theft, and sheer stubbornness. Some had been damaged by substances, others by war, trauma, illness. Society made little distinction. They were all simply the unfortunate deserving of occasional charity, but mostly suspicion and avoidance. Legal consequences also existed. Getting caught with certain substances, especially in suspicious contexts, could lead to accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or poisoning. Trials were brutal. Torture was standard practice for extracting confessions. The logic was simple. Torture causes pain. Guilty people will confess to stop pain. Therefore, confessions obtained by torture are reliable. This logic was catastrophically flawed, but it persisted for centuries. Innocent people confessed to anything under torture. Guilty people confessed, but also implicated others to spread the pain. Specific torture methods varied by region, but shared common goals. cause maximum pain while avoiding death. The rack stretched bodies until joints separated. Thumbscrews crushed fingers. Strappado suspended victims by arms tied behind backs, dislocating shoulders. Water torture drowned victims slowly. Burning applied to feet or other body parts. These weren't medieval horror stories, they were documented legal procedures, applied to people accused of crimes including use of forbidden substances. Punishments, if you survived trial, were harsh. Fines could impoverish families for generations. Imprisonment meant dark, filthy cells with no sanitation, inadequate food, and disease. Mutilation, cutting off fingers, hands, ears, or tongues, marked criminals permanently. Branding did the same. These marked individuals were unemployable, unmarriageable, and often reduced to begging or crime to survive. The punishment extended far beyond the original sentence. Execution methods varied by crime and class. Nobility might be beheaded relatively quickly. Commoners faced hanging, which was often slow strangulation rather than broken neck. Burning alive was reserved for heretics and witches. The cruelty was intentional, both punishment and deterrent. Public executions drew crowds. People brought children. Vendors sold food and drink. It was entertainment, moral lesson, and community bonding all at once. Modern sensibilities recoil. Medieval people found it normal. Even if you survived the legal process, your reputation was destroyed. Accusations alone could ruin lives. Even acquittal didn't erase suspicion. The community remembered. Suspicion followed you. Business relationships ended. Social connections severed. Marriage prospects vanished. Some people rebuilt their lives after accusations. Many couldn't. The stain was permanent. Women faced particular vulnerability to legal consequences. A woman accused of using substances for prohibited purposes, contraception, abortion, love magic, faced trial with presumption of guilt. Her gender itself was evidence. Women were thought more susceptible to demonic influence, more likely to practice maleficium, less rational than men. Defense was nearly impossible. Conviction was nearly certain. Execution was common. The intersection of substance use and gender-based violence was horrific. Women who used herbs to end pregnancies, avoid conception, or ease menstrual pain risked not just execution but torture designed specifically to punish perceived sexual transgression. Their bodies were violated in trials and punishments in ways male accused never faced. This gender-specific cruelty reflected deep anxieties about women's autonomy, sexuality, and knowledge. Children suffered too, though differently. A child showing effects of accidental poisoning or improper medication might simply die. No investigation, no trial, no justice. Infant mortality was too common for one more dead child to trigger inquiry. Older children might testify against accused parents or healers, their words twisted by interrogators into damning evidence. Children whose parents were executed became orphans, facing uncertain futures in hostile communities. Financial ruin accompanied legal consequences. Trial costs, fines, confiscation of property, loss of income during imprisonment, all devastated families. Even if the accused was acquitted, the costs remained. Families sold land, animals, tools, anything to pay legal expenses or support imprisoned relatives. Multi-generational poverty resulted from single accusations. The economic impact rippled through communities, affecting not just the accused but everyone connected to them. In short, medieval drug use was a high-risk activity. The potential benefits, pain relief, visions, escape, were real. But so were the dangers, and in a world without modern medicine, poison control or psychiatric care, those dangers were often fatal. People got high, they also got dead. The line between the two was thin, unpredictable, and crossed far more often than anyone wanted to admit. The survivors carried scars, physical scars from treatments gone wrong, from withdrawal, from legal punishment, mental scars from terrifying experiences, from trauma, from watching others die, social scars from stigma, suspicion, loss of status. These weren't abstract consequences. They were lived, realities that shaped individual trajectories and community dynamics. The price of medieval intoxication was paid in bodies, minds, and social bonds destroyed, and still people used, because sometimes the present pain outweighed future risk. because sometimes escaping reality for a few hours seemed worth any cost. Because they were human, and humans seek relief however they can find it, consequences be damned. Chapter 8. The Social Context. Who could get high, and how did society react? Medieval society was deeply stratified. Your social class determined what you ate, where you lived, what you wore, and yes, what substances you had access to. The rich and the poor both got high, but they did so in very different ways with very different consequences. For the wealthy, nobles, high clergy, successful merchants, access to exotic substances was a mark of status. Imported opium, rare spices, fine wines, and specialized preparations from skilled. Apothecaries were expensive. If you could afford them, you used them. Opium for a toothache, spiced wine for digestion, exotic incenses for prayer. These were luxuries that demonstrated wealth and sophistication. Rich people also had more protection from consequences. If a noble got spectacularly drunk, embarrassed himself and passed out in public, it was scandalous but rarely punished. If he experimented with substances that caused strange behaviour, it might be hushed up, excused as illness, or attributed to divine inspiration. Wealth brought discretion, access to private physicians, and the ability to recover from mistakes without social ruin. For the poor, peasants, labourers, servants, access to substances was limited by cost. They couldn't afford imported opium or fine wine. What they had was local: beer, herbal remedies from hedgerow plants, and whatever the village healer could provide. Some substances, like poppy or cannabis, might be grown locally if the climate allowed. Others required trade or barter. A peasant might exchange labour, goods, or favours for access to a midwife's pain relief or a cunning person's potion. Peasants also faced harsher consequences. A drunk peasant who caused trouble could be fined, beaten, or worse. A peasant woman accused of using herbs suspiciously could be branded a witch. There was no privacy, no discretion. Your neighbours knew everything, and gossip was relentless. If you used substances in ways that seemed unorthodox, dangerous, or heretical, you were vulnerable. Gender also mattered enormously. Men had more freedom to drink, experiment, and make mistakes. Taverns were male-dominated spaces. Getting drunk was expected, even encouraged, as part of male bonding. A man who used herbs for medicine or recreation might be considered eccentric but wasn't automatically suspect. Women, especially poor or unmarried women, faced intense scrutiny. A woman who knew too much about herbs was dangerous. If she was old, ugly, or outspoken, she was even more suspect. Women who brewed beer or prepared medicines were essential to their communities, but they were also vulnerable to accusations. The same knowledge that made them valuable also made them targets. Healers, midwives, and wise women walked a tightrope between respect and suspicion. Sexuality and substance use were also linked in medieval anxieties. Love potions, aphrodisiacs, and contraceptives all fell under the domain of herbalism. Women who provided these services were simultaneously sought after and condemned. A woman who helped another woman avoid pregnancy or end an unwanted pregnancy was committing a sin in the Church's eyes, but she was also performing a service many women desperately needed. This tension played out in countless individual lives, rarely documented but widely understood. Age influenced access and perception. Elders, especially elderly women, were often the keepers of herbal knowledge. They'd lived long enough to learn which plants worked, which didn't, and which killed. Their knowledge was respected, but it also made them vulnerable in times of witch panic. Youth offered some protection, but young people who dabbled in substances risked moral condemnation. A young man getting drunk was sowing wild oats. A young woman doing the same was ruined. Urban versus rural settings also created differences. In cities, regulation was stricter. Guilds controlled the production and sale of beer, wine, and medicines. Authorities monitored taverns and markets. There was more oversight, more law, more consequence. But there was also more access. Cities had apothecaries, foreign traders, and diverse populations bringing different substances and knowledge. Rural areas had less regulation but also less access. Villages relied on local resources and traditional knowledge. Innovation was rare. What your grandparents used, you used. But rural areas also had more freedom from official scrutiny. As long as you didn't cause scandal or attract attention from travelling authorities, you could operate with relative independence. The Church's role was paradoxical. Officially, the Church condemned drunkenness, gluttony, and using substances for pleasure. Excess was sinful. Loss of control was dangerous to the soul. Yet the Church also brewed beer, made wine, grew medicinal herbs, and used incense in rituals. Monks and clergy were among the most knowledgeable people about substances and their effects. They just framed it differently. When a monk used herbs, it was medicine or devotion. When a peasant did the same, it might be witchcraft. This double standard extended to visions and mystical experiences. A saint having visions after fasting and prayer was holy. A peasant having visions after consuming herbs was possessed. The substance or practice mattered less than who was doing it and how it was framed. Context, authority, and social position determined whether an experience was sacred or demonic. Public opinion varied by time and place. During periods of social stress, famine, plague, war, scapegoating increased. People looked for someone to blame. Herbalists, healers, and anyone perceived as different became targets. Witch hunts intensified during crises. Conversely, during stable times, communities tolerated and even embraced their local healers and folk practitioners. They were too useful to persecute. Laws regarding substances were inconsistent. Some regions regulated alcohol production and sale, others didn't. Poisoning was universally illegal, but proving it was difficult. Using herbs for healing was generally acceptable, unless you were accused of witchcraft, in which case the same actions became evidence of devil worship. There was no unified legal framework. Each lord, bishop or town council made their own rules, enforced them inconsistently, and changed them when convenient. In summary, who could get high and how they were treated depended on wealth, gender, age, location, and social context. The rich got away with more. The poor were more vulnerable. Women were more suspect than men. Urban dwellers faced more regulation. Rural people more isolation, and everyone existed within a system that was hypocritical, inconsistent, and often brutal. Medieval drug use wasn't an individual choice, made in a vacuum. It was embedded in power structures, gender dynamics, and social hierarchies that shaped every aspect of life. Chapter 9. Knowledge Transmission. How medieval people learned what got you high and how not to die. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval drug use is how knowledge spread. There were no pharmacology textbooks in the common tongue, no internet forums, no YouTube tutorials. Yet people knew which plants to use, how to prepare them, and what effects to expect. How? The answer is oral tradition, apprenticeship, and texts, but mostly the first two. For the vast majority of medieval people, knowledge about plants and their effects was passed down verbally. Grandmothers taught daughters, midwives trained apprentices, village healers shared knowledge with trusted successors. This was embodied knowledge, learned through demonstration, repetition, and experience. An apprentice healer didn't just memorize plant names. She learned to recognize them in all seasons by sight, smell, and touch. She learned where they grew, when to harvest them, how to dry them, and how to prepare them. She practiced making tinctures, ointments, and teas under supervision. She observed effects firsthand, noting what worked and what didn't. This education took years. It was practical, hands-on, and deeply personal. Oral knowledge had advantages. It was flexible, adapting to local conditions and available plants. It was accessible, not requiring literacy or expensive books. It was resilient, surviving even when official institutions suppressed it. But it also had limitations. Information could be lost if a healer died without passing it on. Details could mutate over generations like a game of telephone, and there was no way to fact-check or verify claims objectively. For the educated elite, monks, physicians, scholars, written texts were available. The most important was De Materia Medica by Dioscorides, a Greek physician from the 1st century. This encyclopedic work described hundreds of plants and their medicinal uses. It was copied, translated, and studied throughout the medieval period. Monasteries had copies in their libraries. Universities used it as a textbook. It was the foundational text of European pharmacology. Other important works included the writings of Galen, Avicenna, and Hippocrates. These ancient and Islamic medical authorities were revered in medieval Europe. Their texts were translated from Greek and Arabic into Latin, making them accessible to educated Europeans. These works contain detailed descriptions of drug preparations, dosages, and effects. They combined empirical observation with theoretical frameworks like the humoral system, which explained health and illness in terms of balancing bodily fluids. Herbals, books describing plants and their uses, became increasingly common in the later medieval period. Some were lavishly illustrated, though the illustrations were often wildly inaccurate. Medieval artists sometimes drew plants they'd never seen based on written descriptions. The result was recognisable plants next to complete fantasies. Still, these herbals circulated knowledge and standardised some understanding of plant medicine. Recipe books and medical compendia also existed. These were practical guides, often compiled by individual physicians or monasteries, containing remedies for specific ailments. They included ingredients, preparation methods, and sometimes warnings about dangerous substances. These books were valuable and carefully guarded. Knowledge was power, and medical knowledge was especially valuable. Trade and travel also spread knowledge. Merchants, pilgrims, and crusaders encountered new substances and practices abroad. They brought back samples, stories, and techniques. A merchant returning from the Middle East might bring opium, hashish, or new methods of distillation. A pilgrim visiting Spain might learn about Arab medical practices. A crusader might encounter substances used by Saracen physicians. This cross-cultural exchange enriched European knowledge, though it was often filtered through prejudice and misunderstanding. The Church played a dual role. On one hand, monasteries preserved and transmitted medical knowledge. Monks copied ancient texts, maintained medicinal gardens, and practiced medicine within their communities. On the other hand, the Church was suspicious of folk healers and non-Christian sources of knowledge. Arab and Jewish physicians were sometimes tolerated for their expertise, but also viewed with suspicion. Women healers were respected when useful, but demonized when threatening. Universities, which emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, began to formalize medical education. Students studied Latin texts, learned the humoral theory, and practiced on the poor. However, university medicine was theoretical and often disconnected from practical healing. A university-trained physician might prescribe bloodletting and astrological timing, while a village midwife used herbs that actually worked. The gap between academic medicine and folk medicine was wide, and each side often dismissed the other. Experimentation also occurred, though it was risky. Some individuals tested substances on themselves, documenting effects. Alchemists, in particular, experimented with distillation, extraction, and combination of substances. They were searching for the philosopher's stone or the elixir of life, but along the way they discovered new chemical processes and medicinal compounds. Their work was secretive, often coded in symbolic language, but it contributed to the slow accumulation of knowledge about substances and their effects. There were no clinical trials, no controlled studies. Knowledge was anecdotal, based on individual experiences and observations. If a remedy seemed to work repeatedly, it was considered effective. If it failed or caused harm, it might be abandoned or modified. This trial and error process was slow and sometimes deadly, but over centuries it produced a body of practical knowledge about which plants did what. Documentation of bad outcomes was rare. If someone died from an herbal remedy, it might be attributed to God's will, natural illness, or user error. There was no systematic tracking of adverse effects. This meant that dangerous practices could persist for generations before being recognised as such. Conversely, effective treatments might be dismissed if they didn't fit existing theoretical frameworks. Regional variation was significant. A healer in Italy used different plants and methods than one in England or Scandinavia. Climate, available flora, and cultural traditions all shaped practice. There was no standardised European pharmacopoeia. What counted as medicine in one place might be unknown in another. This diversity was both a strength, allowing adaptation to local conditions, and a weakness, preventing the spread of effective treatments. By the end of the medieval period, the beginnings of more systematic knowledge were emerging. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, allowed for wider distribution of texts. Herbals, medical guides, and recipe books could be reproduced and sold. Literacy was increasing, though still limited. These changes set the stage for the early modern period. when medicine and pharmacology would begin to develop into more recognizable forms. But in the medieval world, knowledge about getting high, whether for medicine, mysticism, or recreation, was a mix of ancient texts, oral tradition, practical experience, and sheer luck. It was messy, inconsistent, and often dangerous, but it worked well enough that people survived, healed, and occasionally had experiences that transcended the grim realities of medieval life. Chapter 10. The Legacy. How medieval drug use shaped the future and what it tells us about now, so after. All the salves, brews, roots, ointments, incense, beer, and questionable bread, one big question remains. What does medieval drug use tell us? How did it shape the world that came after? And what, if anything, can we learn from it? First, the practical legacy. Many substances used in medieval times remained central to medicine for centuries. Opium became laudanum, which dominated pain management into the 20th century. Digitalis, derived from foxglove, became a heart medication. Willow bark, used for pain and fever, eventually gave us aspirin. Alcohol remained a medical staple until modern antiseptics and anesthetics were developed. The transition from medieval herbalism to modern pharmacology wasn't a clean break. It was gradual, built on centuries of trial, error, and accumulated knowledge. The concept of the pharmacy itself is a medieval legacy. Apothecaries evolved into pharmacies, the idea of a trained professional preparing and dispensing medicine, rather than individuals. Foraging for their own became standard. Regulation, quality control, and standardized dosing, all things medieval people desperately needed but lacked, became central to modern medicine. We take for granted that our pills contain what they say, and that doses are safe. Medieval people had no such assurances. The fear of drugs, particularly substances that alter consciousness, also has medieval roots. The association of certain plants and practices with witchcraft, heresy, and moral corruption shaped later drug prohibition movements. When opium and cocaine became social problems in the 19th and 20th centuries, the response drew on centuries-old fears of loss of control, moral decay, and demonic influence. The language changed, but the underlying anxieties remained. The witch hunts of the early modern period, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, were directly connected to medieval attitudes toward herbalism, especially among women. The knowledge that had been essential to community survival became evidence of devil worship. Healers who had been tolerated, even valued, were tortured and executed. Tens of thousands died. This wasn't just about religion or gender, it was also about controlling knowledge, especially knowledge about the body, reproduction, and consciousness-altering substances. Medieval drug use also highlights the inseparability of medicine and culture. What counts as medicine versus poison, healing versus witchcraft, sacred versus profane. These distinctions are cultural, not purely chemical. The same substance can be a sacrament, a medicine, or a crime depending on context. Medieval people understood this implicitly. Modern drug policy often pretends otherwise, treating substances as inherently good or bad, ignoring the social, medical, and spiritual contexts in which they're used. The role of inequality is also striking. In medieval times, the rich had access to safer, purer substances and better medical care. The poor made do, with whatever they could find or afford, often at great risk. Sound familiar? Drug quality, access to treatment, and legal consequences remain deeply unequal today. Wealth still buys safety. Poverty still increases risk. The medieval pattern persists. There's also a lesson about knowledge and authority. Medieval people often knew, through experience, which plants worked for which ailments. But official medicine, tied to ancient texts and theoretical frameworks, often ignored or dismissed folk knowledge. Effective treatments were overlooked because they didn't fit prevailing theories. This tension between empirical knowledge and institutional authority hasn't disappeared. Alternative medicine, traditional practices, and patient experiences still struggle for recognition against establishment medicine, even when they work. The mystical dimension of medieval drug use reminds us that humans have always sought transcendence. Whether through fasting, prayer, meditation, or substances, the desire to experience something beyond ordinary consciousness is deeply human. Medieval people pursued visions to connect with the divine. Modern people use psychedelics for similar reasons, framed differently but fundamentally the same. The search for meaning, connection, and transformation drives drug use across cultures and centuries. Medieval attitudes toward alcohol reveal the hypocrisy and double standards that persist. Alcohol was everywhere, consumed by everyone, including those who preached temperance. It caused immense harm, violence, illness, death, but was socially accepted and economically important. Sound familiar? We still live in societies that tolerate alcohol while criminalizing other substances, often for reasons unrelated to actual harm. The medieval pattern of accepting the familiar while fearing the exotic continues. There's also the simple fact that people in terrible circumstances seek escape. Medieval life was brutal: pain, disease, death, oppression. These weren't abstract concepts. They were daily realities. If you had access to something that eased the pain or provided a few hours of relief, you used it. Judging medieval people for getting high is pointless. They were doing what humans have always done, trying to survive and occasionally find a little joy or meaning in a harsh world. The story of medieval drug use is ultimately a story about people, their ingenuity, desperation, spirituality, and vulnerability. They worked with what they had, took enormous risks, and passed down knowledge that has shaped our world. Some of that knowledge became modern medicine, some became cautionary tales, some was lost, but it all mattered. Looking back from our modern perspective, with our synthetic drugs, clinical trials, and prescription regulations, it's easy to feel superior. But we're not so different. We still struggle with addiction, bad drug policy, inequality in healthcare, and the tension between individual freedom and social control. We still seek altered states for healing, escape, and transcendence. We still fear what we don't understand and demonize those who use substances we've deemed unacceptable. Medieval people got high. They did it for medicine, spirituality, recreation, and survival. Some experiences were transcendent. Some were horrifying. Most were somewhere in between. They didn't have our knowledge or tools, but they had the same human needs, desires, and fears. And in their messy, dangerous, contradictory relationship with mind-altering substances, we can see reflections of our own world. So what does medieval drug use teach us? That humans are inventive, resilient, and endlessly complicated. That substances are tools, not inherently good or evil. That context, culture, and power shape how we understand and regulate what we put in our bodies. That knowledge is precious and often suppressed. That suffering drives people to seek relief, even at great risk. And that the line between medicine and poison, sacred and profane, healer and witch, has always been blurrier than we like to admit. The medieval world was a long time ago, but in some ways, when it comes to drugs, we're still living in its shadow. We've gained knowledge, lost knowledge, and rebuilt knowledge. We've made progress and repeated mistakes. We've learned some lessons and ignored others. The story continues, as it always has, with humans seeking, experimenting, healing, harming, and trying to make sense of consciousness in all its altered states. And honestly, given the world we're living in now, the stress, the uncertainty, the endless scroll of bad news, it's hard to blame medieval people for occasionally wanting to drink some sketchy herbal wine and forget about the feudal system for a few hours. We're not so different after all.